entitled relative of a friend thought paying me peanuts meant I was her personal servant, found out I could just leave. I work full-time as a professional engineer in a pretty demanding field. On occasion, I'll take on a small consulting gig on the side, but usually this is strictly as a favor for friends or people I know well. It's not something I rely on for income, and when I do it, I charge significantly less than a typical firm would, essentially just covering my time at a very reduced rate. It's more about helping people out than running a business. A good friend of mine reached out and asked if I'd be willing to lend my expertise to his in-laws. They were embarking on a rather substantial renovation and addition project on an older property they had recently acquired. My friend knew I had the right skills, and because it was for his family, I reluctantly agreed, purely as a personal favor to him. I took a look at their initial plans, and it was immediately clear this was going to be a complex job. Older houses often hide a lot of structural surprises, and the scale of the changes they wanted to make meant there were definitely going to be some potential cans of worms to deal with. Despite the red flags, I committed to helping out my friend. My friend had given me a heads up that his mother-in-law, who seemed to be the primary driver of the project and the main point of contact, could be a bit challenging to deal with. He described her as unpleasant, but honestly, that turned out to be quite an understatement. From the moment I started interacting with her, her demeanor was off-putting. She seemed to operate under the assumption that because she was technically paying me, albeit a tiny fraction of my usual professional rate, something I made clear up front was a favor price. I was essentially her personal employee, available to jump at her command. Our early interactions were mostly through email, as I reviewed their existing plans and started identifying potential issues or areas that would require more detailed investigation. When I pointed out concerns about structural integrity, code compliance, or the feasibility of certain design elements, she would become quite dismissive and rude in her responses. It was frustrating, especially since I was trying to help them avoid costly mistakes down the line. But I managed to tolerate it, reminding myself I was doing this for my friend, and the compensation wasn't worth getting worked up over. The real trouble began when it came time for me to visit the property to conduct an on-site inspection. I needed to get a better look at some key areas to verify dimensions, assess structural components, and understand the existing conditions firsthand. This required scheduling a time when I could be physically present at the house. Given that this was a side gig done outside of my regular demanding job hours, I offered several options for visiting, primarily on weekends or during weekday evenings after my normal workday had concluded. These are standard times for side work or personal appointments when you have a full-time job. Her response to my proposed times was immediate and absolute rejection. Weekends, number evenings, also number she insisted quite forcefully that I needed to come during her preferred time slot, which happened to be right in the middle of my standard 9 to 5 office hours. When I politely but firmly explained that my availability for this side work was limited to evenings and weekends due to my primary employment, her attitude shifted dramatically from merely rude to outright hostile. She became incredibly demanding, stating flatly that since she was paying me, I worked on her schedule, not the other way around. Her emails grew sharp and aggressive, filled with indignant pronouncements about how clients dictate terms and professionals must accommodate. It was astonishing, especially given the context. I was doing a friend a massive favor, charging next to nothing, and she was acting like she had hired a full-time on-call personal consultant. The level of entitlement was frankly breathtaking. She genuinely believed that her minimal payment entitled her to control my entire working schedule, demanding I take time off from my actual job just to suit her convenience. That was the moment I decided I was done. The minimal payment wasn't worth the headache, the disrespect, and the sheer audacity of her demands. I drafted a concise email, CCing my friend, stating that I was withdrawing my services from the project effective immediately. I wished them good luck finding someone else to assist with their renovations. I sent it and felt an immediate sense of relief. Her reply email came back almost instantly, and it was clear she was utterly stunned that I had actually walked away. She expressed disbelief and indignation, repeating her mantra that this wasn't how business is conducted. She genuinely seemed to think she had me trapped because she was paying me. I didn't bother responding to her follow-up. There was nothing left to say. About 3 weeks later, I received an email, this time from her husband. He was much more polite and asked if I would reconsider, promising that his wife would not be involved in any future communication or decision-making regarding my part of the project. While I appreciated his attempt, I knew it wasn't a situation I wanted to re-enter. I politely declined, explaining that I had moved on. I simply didn't believe the wife would actually stay out of it, and I had no desire to bail them out after her behavior. I heard from my friend a little while later about how things were progressing or not progressing with his in-laws' renovation. He said they had eventually found other engineering firms to provide quotes for the necessary design and inspection work. The quotes, as expected, came back significantly higher than what I would have charged, which was tolerable for them financially. However, the real problem they encountered was the lead time. The construction and design industry in our area is incredibly busy right now. When you approach firms drowning in work with a potentially complicated and messy project involving an older house and significant structural changes, they aren't exactly jumping at the opportunity. They prioritize easier, more straightforward jobs or clients they already have relationships with. As a result, they were quoted design timelines that were months out, potentially 1 or 2 months, just for the initial design work before construction could even properly begin. This created a cascade effect. They had already lined up some trades, contractors, plumbers, electricians, etc., who were ready to start work, but those trades couldn't proceed without the necessary approved engineering plans and inspections. Because the design phase was now pushed so far out, they were in jeopardy of losing the contractors they had booked, who would naturally move on to other jobs where they could actually start working. My friend seemed quite satisfied with the outcome, at least from the perspective of his mother-in-law facing the consequences of her attitude. He commented that while he felt a little bad for his father-in-law, it was genuinely nice watching his wife's entitled behavior create problems that directly impacted her ability to move forward with her desired project timeline. They had just bought the house and were eager to move in quickly, but her insistence on treating a favor as a dictatorial business relationship and demanding I conform to her impossible schedule had effectively stalled their entire project, costing them both time and potentially their preferred contractors. It was a clear, direct consequence of her entitlement. Demanding someone take off work for a side gig, that entitlement just stalled her whole project, and you should totally subscribe for more sweet karma. Entitled parent demands my drink for her kid on a flight gets a reality check. I recently took a rather long flight back from Dubai, and unfortunately I was seated near a mother and her incredibly unruly child. Even before the flight properly began, I had a sense of dread wash over me. Past experiences with disruptive children on planes had left me wary, and I was already bracing myself for a potentially unpleasant journey. My mood was not exactly soaring high as we prepared for takeoff. The initial phase of the flight was deceptively calm, lulling me into a false sense of security. However, it didn't take long for the situation to deteriorate. The child, who appeared to be around 5 or 6 years old, quickly became a source of chaos in the cabin. He was running up and down the aisle with seemingly boundless energy, treating the plane like his personal playground. Toys were being thrown haphazardly, sometimes hitting seats or even other passengers. He was loud, disruptive, and making a significant mess around their seating area and the aisle. The flight attendants were clearly trying their best to manage the situation, politely asking the child to sit down or calm down when they passed by, but their efforts were constantly undermined by the mother's complete lack of intervention. She seemed utterly oblivious or simply uninterested in her child's behavior. For large portions of the flight, she was engrossed in her phone, scrolling away as if the pandemonium her child was causing was entirely normal or someone else's problem. When people would give her or the child exasperated looks, she would either ignore them or offer a dismissive wave and a comment like, "Oh, he's just being a kid, ignore him," effectively telling everyone else to just tolerate the disruption. About halfway through the flight, wanting a refreshing drink, I ordered a can of Coke from the flight attendant during the beverage service. The moment the attendant handed it to me and I placed it on my tray table, the child's attention immediately fixated on the can. His eyes locked onto the bright red packaging, and he started whining loudly, pointing incessantly at my drink and making a fuss. He was clearly demanding it. Before I could even take a sip, the mother leaned across the aisle towards me. Her expression was one of entitled expectation, accompanied by a rather dirty look that suggested I was being incredibly selfish for possessing a beverage her child desired. In a tone that was dripping with arrogance and sounded more like an order than a request, she stated, "He really wants your drink, just give it to him." I was genuinely taken aback by her audacity. My immediate thought was, it's a free soft drink on a plane. Why on earth would you demand mine instead of just asking the flight attendant for one for your own child? It made absolutely no sense other than a pure sense of entitlement that she felt her child's wants superseded anyone else's possession of a complimentary beverage. I managed to compose myself and politely but firmly declined her demand. I explained that I had just received it and suggested that she could easily ask the flight attendant for a Coke for her son when they came by again, or by pressing the call button. My reasonable suggestion was met with an exaggerated huff and a dramatic roll of her eyes. She muttered something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch, but her body language conveyed extreme annoyance and disbelief that I hadn't immediately caved to her demand. Now, I'll admit, I can be a bit petty when faced with such blatant entitlement. Feeling annoyed by her reaction and her previous dismissal of her child's behavior, I decided to take my time enjoying my drink. I picked up my headphones, put on some music, loud enough that I could barely hear her or the child but not so loud as to disturb others, and slowly savored my Coke, making sure she could see me doing so. To further my petty endeavor, when the attendant came by later collecting trash, I asked for another Coke. As the attendant was in the process of handing the second can to me, the child, still apparently fixated on the idea of getting a Coke, made a lunge and tried to snatch the can directly from the flight attendant's hand. This was clearly the final straw for the attendant, who had been dealing with the child's disruptive behavior throughout the flight. The attendant turned to the mother and, in a voice that was quiet but incredibly stern and firm, instructed her to control her child and ensure he remained seated and calm. The mother's reaction was a display of pure, indignant frustration. She huffed and puffed, her face turning red, looking like someone who had just been unjustly reprimanded by a strict teacher. For the remainder of the flight, she alternated between glaring daggers at me, as if I was somehow responsible for the attendant telling her off, and trying somewhat ineffectively to keep her restless child in his seat, who continued to cause minor disturbances until we landed. It truly baffles me how some parents operate in public. They seem to believe that the world should simply accommodate their child's every whim and their own lack of effective parenting. It makes you wonder why they choose to have children if they aren't prepared to put in the effort to teach them basic behavior and consideration for others, especially in confined public spaces like an airplane cabin, where everyone is affected by one person's disruptive behavior. The entire experience was a frustrating reminder of how entitlement can manifest in parents who expect others to simply tolerate their poorly behaved children. My neighbor demanded I turn off my Wi-Fi because it's spiritually wilting her plants. Life in my townhouse complex is rarely dull. The walls here are incredibly thin, which means you're often privy to the various sounds and personalities of your neighbors. And let me tell you, we have a whole assortment of colorful characters living in close proximity. One of the most memorable among them is my next door neighbor, a woman who I'd estimate is in her late 50s. She has a very distinct style, favoring tie-dye clothing on a daily basis, regardless of the weather or occasion. Her beliefs are equally distinct. She's someone who genuinely insists she possesses a telepathic connection with crystals and often talks about energy fields and auras. I remember one particularly strange interaction where she informed me with complete seriousness that my aura felt too digital. This was likely because I often work or relax on my laptop or phone right outside my front door where she can see me. I thought the too digital aura comment was the peak of her eccentricities, but I was wrong. Her most recent demand truly surpassed anything I could have imagined. It happened just last week. There was a knock on my door, and when I opened it, there she stood holding two items. In one hand, she cradled a small potted succulent plant. In the other, she held up a piece of paper with what looked like a hand-drawn diagram on it. Her expression was serious, almost concerned, and she immediately stated that we needed to have a conversation about my internet router. Naturally, I was completely confused. I couldn't fathom what my router could possibly have to do with her, let alone her plants. She then proceeded to explain her bizarre theory. According to her, the signal from my Wi-Fi router was actively disrupting the vibrational energy of her succulent plants. She pointed to the drawing she was holding, which honestly resembled a rather sad blob-like jellyfish more than any kind of technical diagram, and insisted that the Wi-Fi signal was beaming directly through our shared wall, bombarding her poor plants non-stop. She claimed that because the Wi-Fi signal was a form of energy, her plants were mistakenly interpreting it as sunlight. However, since it wasn't actual sunlight, they were getting confused and were consequently spiritually wilting. The sheer absurdity of this claim was almost enough to make me laugh right there, but I managed to keep a straight face, at least initially. What made her claim even more ridiculous was the fact that the specific plants she was worried about were located in a dark hallway inside her unit, a place with absolutely no natural light whatsoever. The idea that they were confusing a Wi-Fi signal for sunlight in a windowless hallway was beyond comprehension. She continued her explanation, stating that her plants had been perfectly fine until I recently upgraded my modem and router, implying that my new, stronger signal was the culprit behind their supposed spiritual decline. Then came the demands. She presented me with two options, both delivered with the full expectation that I would comply without question. Option 1 was that I had to turn off my Wi-Fi every single night between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. She referred to this period as the plant's crucial rest hours. Option 2, if turning it off was too inconvenient for me, was that I should allow her to share my Wi-Fi connection and furthermore, move my router into her unit so she could regulate the signal properly to protect her plants. At this point, despite my best efforts, I couldn't hold back anymore. The combination of the bizarre claim, the hand-drawn diagram, the location of the plants, and the utterly audacious demands was just too much. I started laughing. I genuinely thought she was pulling some kind of elaborate, albeit very strange prank. But as soon as I started laughing, her expression hardened. It became clear she was absolutely serious. She became visibly annoyed and without another word turned and stormed off back into her unit, clutching her plant and her diagram. I'm still here, slightly bewildered, waiting to see what her next move will be now that I failed to immediately comply with her demands to protect her spiritually wilting succulents from my digital aura and rogue Wi-Fi signals. It's never a dull moment with this neighbor. Demanding you turn off your Wi-Fi because it's spiritually wilting her plants in a dark hallway? You cannot make this stuff up. Rich acquaintance reaches out after years, offers me $200 a week to care for their aunt so they can vacation. Had a rather bizarre phone call this evening from someone I haven't really spoken to in probably 5 years, maybe even longer. I'll call him Marcus. The call started innocuously enough, just some casual catching up, asking how things have been. Eventually the conversation drifted towards work, which is where things started to get interesting. I mentioned that I'm currently between full-time positions and actively looking for new opportunities. Marcus acknowledged that the job market can be tough right now, but then quickly pivoted to discussing his own financial situation, which apparently is quite robust. He talked about how he and his family were in the process of divesting from a business they've owned for decades. He referred to their former clientele in a rather detached and slightly insulting way, saying something like, "The suckers aren't buying anything anymore," which I found a little off-putting. I gave a small, awkward laugh, trying to brush it off, figuring maybe he was just feeling a bit down about closing the business. He then proceeded to detail their summer plans, which involved splitting their time between their home in New England and another property they own on the West Coast, specifically in a highly desirable area right on the beach. The reason for this bi-coastal summer plan? To escape the heat down south where their primary residence is located. I commented that it sounded like quite the fortunate situation, a classic good problem to have, and we shared another laugh, though mine was starting to feel a bit forced as I sensed where this might be going. And then he dropped the bomb. This is where the entitlement really kicked in. He explained that they had an urgent need for someone to care for their elderly aunt who lives with them. He described her as being extremely obese and nearly bedbound, requiring significant assistance. The scope of the job he laid out was intense, caring for her 7 days a week with absolutely no days off. For the entire 3 months, they plan to be away enjoying their various luxurious homes. But here's the kicker, the part that truly illustrates the level of entitlement and detachment from reality. For this demanding, round-the-clock responsibility of caring for a severely incapacitated elderly person for 3 straight months, they were offering a fellow human being a grand total of $200 per week. Yes, you read that right. $200 for 7 days of care. His justification for this absurdly low wage was that it was light duty. He tried to sweeten the deal by saying I would have my own room in their house, which he seemed to think was a major perk. I own my own home, so the offer of a room held absolutely no interest or value for me whatsoever. To add insult to injury, their primary home down south, where this care would be needed during the hottest months of the year, is not air-conditioned, so the job wasn't just incredibly demanding and ridiculously underpaid, it also involved working in potentially sweltering conditions, caring for someone who would undoubtedly be uncomfortable in the heat. I had to pause for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of the request and the proposed compensation. Then I politely but firmly explained that I would have to pass on his offer. I couldn't possibly take on a job of that magnitude with those responsibilities for such a pittance. My refusal seemed to genuinely shock and insult him. He started whining, saying they didn't know anyone else as nice or capable as me. He even brought up my previous career as a flight attendant, stating that because of that, I surely knew the first aid in serving foodstuff, implying my past experience somehow qualified me for full-time geriatric care for a pittance. I reiterated that I appreciated him thinking of me, but the offer wasn't viable for me financially or practically. He still seemed confused and resistant to accepting my no. His final words were that he would call me again in about a week, apparently expecting that I would change my mind after having time to think about his generous offer. The call ended shortly after that. As soon as I hung up, I went straight to my phone's contacts and blocked his number. There was no way I was going to entertain that proposition any further or even risk having that conversation again. The level of entitlement displayed by someone who can afford multiple homes and luxurious summer vacations, yet expects someone to provide intensive full-time care for 3 months for less than minimum wage was truly astounding. $200 a week for full-time care while they vacation, unbelievable entitlement. What's the most insulting job offer you've ever heard? Let me know in the comments. Entitled woman causes chaos in the drive-thru, learns the hard way that karma and cops don't play. So, I was at my local Chick-fil-A the other day, trying to grab a quick meal. This particular location is set up with 2 drive-thru lanes, which is pretty common now to help with the efficiency. One lane is for standard orders, where you talk to someone and pay at the first window, and the other is specifically for mobile orders placed through their app, allowing you to scan a QR code and skip the main ordering queue, usually making things much faster. I almost always use the mobile lane because, well, who doesn't want to save time? Unfortunately, this day was anything but fast thanks to the arrival of our protagonist, the entitled woman, EW. The trouble started before we even got to the ordering points. As I was pulling into the parking lot to get into the drive-thru line, she abruptly cut me off, swerving into the mobile lane ahead of me. Annoying, but okay, there was nobody else in the mobile lane at that moment, so it wasn't a complete disaster yet. I pulled in right behind her, expecting her to have her phone ready to scan her mobile order code. But no, that's not what she was doing. Instead, she was just sitting there, waving her hand dismissively at the employees who were out taking orders in the other lane. It seemed she didn't understand how the mobile lane worked, or perhaps she just felt she was too important to use the app. The key thing about the mobile lane is that you scan your code and your order goes straight to the kitchen. There's no employee stationed there to take new non-mobile orders, so naturally she wasn't getting any attention. After a few moments of being ignored because she was in the wrong place doing the wrong thing, she started laying on her car horn. Not just a quick beat, but a prolonged, angry blare like a complete lunatic demanding service. The noise was disruptive and completely unnecessary. Eventually, one of the employees from the regular ordering lane had to walk over to see what the commotion was about. Before the poor guy even reached her car window, she started barking out her order, loud and demanding. And it wasn't a small order either. She rattled off what sounded like enough food to feed an entire family or possibly a small army. After finishing her lengthy order, she just started to drive forward towards the pickup window, completely bypassing the point where you're supposed to pay at this location. The employee who had just taken her order had to actually chase after her car to get her to stop and pay for her food. It was a ridiculous scene watching him have to run after her just to complete the basic transaction. Once she finally paid, she pulled up to the window where orders are handed out. This is where I come back into the picture. I had been patiently waiting behind her this whole time. My mobile order was ready almost instantly after I scanned my code, which I had done while she was still arguing or paying. So there I was, stuck directly behind her car, my food sitting at the window while she was causing a bottleneck. The employee at the window, likely having been informed of the situation or seeing the large order size, politely asked her to pull forward to one of the designated waiting spots in the parking lot. This is standard procedure for large orders or items that take a little longer to keep the drive-thru line moving for people whose orders are ready. Her response was an immediate and flat refusal. She scoffed, saying, "No, I'm not pulling around. It always takes longer if I pull around." This is a common basis complaint from entitled customers who think being asked to wait in a spot somehow pushes their order to the bottom of the list. The employee's touch and bless his patience tried to explain that pulling around wouldn't actually delay her order. He calmly explained that the food was being prepared and moving forward would simply allow them to hand me my order, which was ready, and serve the other people who were now lining up behind me, whose food might also be ready or quicker to make than her large order. Her response was incredible. She actually said, "It's not really fair to prepare their orders before mine when I was here first." Shoot, she genuinely believed the kitchen staff should halt all other operations to focus solely on her massive order because she arrived first, even though she had misused the lane and caused delays herself. She wasn't done. The employee attempted to explain how the kitchen operates with different stations for different items and how that allows them to prepare multiple orders simultaneously. She cut him off mid-sentence and delivered a condescending gem. "They should all be working on the first person's order. I know you just make minimum wage, but this really shouldn't be that hard to understand." The sheer arrogance and disrespect coupled with the minimum wage jab was astounding. This stalemate went on for what felt like an eternity, backing up the entire drive-through line. Finally, the manager came over to the window to handle the situation. He leaned out and, with remarkable politeness given the circumstances, asked her again to please pull forward to a waiting spot. He even went the extra mile, promising that he would personally walk her food out to her car as soon as it was ready to ensure she got it quickly. To top off his efforts to de-escalate and appease her, he offered her a complimentary peppermint shake as an apology for any perceived inconvenience. And what did the entitled woman do? In a display of pure, unadulterated rage and entitlement, she reached out and deliberately knocked the shake right out of the manager's hand. It went flying everywhere, splashing all over the manager, inside the service window area, creating an absolute mess. She even had the audacity to honk her horn at him again after doing it. This is where things started to take a turn for her, thanks to a little bit of instant karma. Just a couple of minutes after the shake incident, 2 police officers calmly walked around the front of the drive-through line and approached her car. They happened to be inside the restaurant, possibly getting their own food, or just present, and had witnessed the commotion, heard the honking and shouting, and seen the manager get covered in the shake. EW saw them approaching and actually laughed at the manager, scoffing, "You really called the police?" She still seemed to think she was untouchable. The manager, completely calm despite being covered in sticky shake, responded, "No ma'am, they were already inside. They were at the counter when I walked by, covered in the shake you knocked over. They also heard your shouting and honking. I told them it was fine, but they wanted to check on the situation." The officers reached her car window and informed her that she needed to pull forward and speak with them. They made it clear that if she didn't comply, they would arrest her on the spot for assault, for hitting the manager with the shake, and have her car towed. Finally, faced with actual consequences, she put her car in gear and started to pull forward, seemingly complying. But instead of pulling into a waiting spot or stopping to talk to the officers as instructed, she just sped out of the parking lot and drove away, attempting to flee the scene. The police officers just watched her go, and honestly, they seemed almost amused. One of them turned to the manager and commented that since she had a very distinctive and easy to remember vanity license plate, they would have no trouble tracking her down. He added that they would be adding a charge of obstruction of justice for failing to comply with a lawful order on top of the initial assault charge when they caught up with her. It was incredibly satisfying to witness her entitlement blow up in her face so spectacularly, ending with her facing legal consequences instead of just getting her way. Knocking a shake out of the manager's hand and fleeing from the cops, that's next level entitlement getting caught. Don't forget to like and subscribe and tell me which story was your favorite today.